2009 is the 30th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, an event of epic proportions that has had repercussions throughout the Middle East and the world. The policies of the Iranian government are controversial, and there has been tension between Iran and some of its neighbors, as well as the United States and Europe. The new President, Barack Obama, and his administration in the United States may bring some changes to the U.S. approach towards Iran, but much debate is going on right now. So it is too early to tell how things will shape up in the months and years to come. And for that, we are going to turn to our panel to further discuss the current status and the future. As we mentioned, Conflict Solutions International is an independent, non-governmental organization, and it takes no position on the issues that we will be presenting this evening. We do, however, make an effort to bring to the public views that are not adequately represented in the mass media. Tonight, we are pleased to hear the views of Iran, the West, and the Arab world.
I'm here in part because I have been fortunate enough to develop relationships with the people and leaders of Iran over the past few years. In my previous position with the National Cathedral, I was able to travel to Iran several times and hear firsthand Iranians' impressions of the revolution, their current political system, and their impressions of America and Americans. Before we delve into discussing Iran in the 30 years since the revolution, I'd like to, and the various complex aspects of the U.S.-Iran relationship, I'd like to reflect on the history and the national mindset that brought Iran to the point of revolution in the first place. Because I think that mindset still informs much of who Iran is today, including its domestic politics, its foreign policy, and primarily how it perceives itself in the world. The revolution in Iran was groundbreaking in many respects, in part because for the first time, Shia clerics engaged themselves in the rewriting of the country's constitution to align its laws more closely with Islamic jurisprudence. But as we know, the revolution was also the culmination of years of national frustration with a Shah whose regime was seen not only as corrupt, brutal, and extravagant, but who was himself considered to be the puppet of non-Muslim Western powers, especially the United States. Now, we have many ideas in this country about and perceptions about what that revolution was about, but I imagine they differ pretty dramatically from how Iranians perceive it. On one of my trips to Iran, I asked a young cleric what the revolution meant to Iranians. More specifically, did they see it as a political revolution or as a religious revolution? His answer was an emphatic affirmation that it was indeed a religious revolution. I think this is hard for many Americans to fathom because the images emblazoned on our minds from that period are those of angry demonstrators in the streets of Tehran chanting "Death to America" as our hostages were led blindfolded to the entrance of the U.S. Embassy. Hardly what one would describe or envision as religious images. Also, it's fascinating to listen to the speeches of Ayatollah Khomeini during that period, before and after the revolution, because there is rarely a time when he does not mention the fact that Iran did not wish to be, nor would it be, the servants of the United States. The language of servitude is very powerful within Iran's political context due to its very painful history of tortured relationships with Western and Eastern powers. For a country like the United States, which has been founded on the principles of progress, self-determination, and pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, it is hard to grasp the psychological dimensions of repeated defeat and control at the hand of foreign powers. Yet Iran's past is infused with these themes. Iran's history, both religious and political, is characterized by the domination of meddlesome and oppressive powers. Early Shia Muslims suffered the tyranny of the caliphs and their administrators, and one by one, their imams were assassinated. More recent Iranian history is characterized by at least 2 centuries of military aggression, domestic meddling, and even technological denial by the West. Even an Iranian with little or no interest in his or her past is aware of the great game that saw Russia and Britain jealously battle for control of Iran and deprive the nation of basic technology like the railroad, with little regard for the wishes of the Iranian people or respect for the nation's sovereignty. When a railroad was finally built by the Shah, it was taken over by the British, Russian, and American forces to move troops to Moscow, at which time Winston Churchill forced the Shah to abdicate and kicked him out of the country. And just as many Americans bear the psychic scars of the hostage crisis, every schoolchild in Iran knows about the CIA-sponsored coup that toppled democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, an event which provided America and Britain with access to Iranian oil and put a despotic Shah in power. Add to this the repeated calls for regime change on the part of the United States, which have dominated the U.S.-Iran discourse for decades. It's not hard to see how these painful memories have dramatically impacted the Iranian collective psyche. Within this context, it is also easy to see how the pursuit of nuclear energy, for instance, has become an act of national defiance in the face of yet another foreign aggressor, a mindset that goes far beyond the motives of the current regime. It is also the reason why any mention of regime change, even when there is dissatisfaction among Iranians with their current leadership, is so abhorrent to the Iranian people. I think it is safe to say that, given its history, the last thing Iranians feel they need is another meddlesome or bullying foreign power telling them what to do or how to conduct their affairs. Of course, this approach is even less effective when threatening language is woven into a presumably diplomatic dialogue. And for the last 30 years, unfortunately, U.S. policy towards Iran has been dominated by sanctions, pressure, and various forms of threats. It has been fascinating to watch the evolution of Iranian politics since 1979, particularly in light of the regime's demands that its policies serve both Iran and Islam. Initially, Islam came first, as Iran's foreign policy emphasized exporting the revolution to neighboring Arab nations. Over time, Iran's foreign policy has become more pragmatic and focused upon Iran's national interest and integration into the international community. While it is true that fundamentalist leaders continue to push for a more Islamic approach to governance, when push comes to shove, Iranians will rally around the flag and choose nationalism over Islamic ideals. For these reasons and others, Iranian politics are understandably confusing to Westerners. Even Condoleezza Rice admitted that she did not fully understand Iranian politics. But the United States' refusal or failure to understand how the Iranian political system works has been damaging to this critical relationship. Clearly, a new conceptualization is needed, beginning with the understanding that Iran's political system is very complex and not managed under the auspices of a few individual political leaders. It is a very fractured system with tremendous conflict and competition within the power structure, and contains factions within factions within factions, all of which are vying for power and control. As a start, U.S. leaders must acknowledge that politicians or political factions giving in to the demands of external forces is simply unacceptable in a country that has gone through a populist revolution and is constantly struggling with asserting its sovereignty. Along these lines, it is worth noting that external pressure from the U.S. and other nations had often created the very opposite reactions that were intended. When under external attack, the Iranian political environment has moved to the right and become more hardlined and nationalistic. U.S. efforts to control Iran through containment, isolation, threats, and sanctions have all been tried on and off for the past 30 years. And while there is evidence that economic sanctions and isolation have harmed the Iranian people economically, there is absolutely no evidence that these actions have impacted the Iranian political establishment or its behavior in the intended direction. In fact, there is ample evidence in the opposite direction, in that it has created a more strident foreign policy. Clearly, a new approach to Iran is needed at this time. I would like to offer two very simple but powerful suggestions for moving forward in U.S.-Iran relations. First and foremost, I believe the U.S. should engage in dialogue with Iran without preconditions. Direct, unconditional, and sustained engagement around shared interests, specifically the stabilization of Iraq and Afghanistan, is the best and most logical place to start, and will allow for the development of a foundation of at least cooperation, if not trust, in a relationship that has been characterized by suspicion and animosity for decades.